Oh, that sounds so amazing, and I'm so excited to read this anthology now because I think, I mean, I've already been sold, like, which is why like we included it in the collection in the first place. But like everything you just said, just drives like hits really close to home, and that's absolutely incredible. I can't wait to get my hands on it, and I think it's very important, politically speaking, that this anthology was released in this year, in a time in which um, Western countries around the world, and not just, but mainly Western countries around the world, are like experiencing rapid growth in like xenophobia and racism and fascism and nationalism, in a time in a country which is so hostile to migrants, but especially undocumented migrants, and especially migrants of color. I feel like that's an incredible project to release, and it sounds really powerful. So thank you. Well, yeah. um, Before, like, all right, so I'm gonna go into some more like questions, but like, I think, yeah, what I wanted to ask you, like, what do you think about like your experiences with like diaspora, migration, and in particular like of being an undocumented immigrant, because there's quite a big difference between being like a middle upper class immigrant who goes through all the papers and gets all the visas and like gets the green card and all that stuff, and somebody who can't do that, or who for a long time is undocumented. How do you think that like affects your writing or your experiences?
Great question. I feel like it could be like a whole ass like book of answering and multiple chapters in it. I think in hearing that question, I'm drawn to like answering the reasons why many people migrate. I think like even now there's if now and in a couple more years, there's going to be a mass migration of climate refugees because of like our just like where ecologically we're at as like a global world. So there's going to be forced migration, climate refugees, economic reasons why people are migrating, being displaced, the interference of like our political of empires into many countries and communities, femicide to like, just like the attacks on like queer trans bodies, non-binary bodies. And I think that oftentimes the rhetoric of the conversation about migration or undocumentedness puts the fault at the individual, versus recognizing that there's so many layers of like empire, of like countries, policies, white supremacy, that pushes many of our folks to migrate. And one of the things that it was important for me in the anthology Somewhere We Are Human, as well as like in my chapbook, Nostalgia and Borders, is to help reimagine like who is like this migrant person, because oftentimes we're talked about as policy or as talking points, but we're forgotten as like human beings. And so that informs a lot of the pieces and the poems, the collaborative visual art images that I do with other visual artists, to films, to cultural projects. It informs in the way that I want to center the humanity of our migrant, undocumented communities. Like what are, we're not just like talking points, but we date, we fuck, we're messy, we are multi-layered people. Some of us are like have a mixed relationship with our home country. We love our home country, and we also may want to go back, or maybe never want to go back. Maybe there's relationships with like our mixed relationships with the country that we currently live in. There's a lot of like trauma and ache and just like different layers of us being human beings. And so I think that informs the way that I think of my poetry, is like, how do I approach it in a way that adds complicatedness to our narrative that has been made easily digestible for policy reasons or for legislation. And I think that allowing us to show our nuance and to show us in different facets, then we can have like more honest conversations about immigration reform and what policies, because there's not one fit all policy that can address all the reasons people are migrating or help adjust people's and their immigration status. That will be too silly and too easy and too, it will leave a lot of our communities out. And so, yeah, my own immigration story is I migrated when I was 5 years old. My parents had come first. I reunited with them at the age of 5. And my current work is examining the stories that existed before the migration. For a lot of migrant artists and cultural workers are, because of like mainstream ones and like this like mainstream conversation about migration, we're only fixated or we're only put into the box of like, talk about your migration from here on, but forget that you existed before migration, forget your lineage, forget that there were stories, that you had nicknames at home, forget, that you were loved, forget those stories of your grandparents, just talk about like your migration point existing within the United States. And I feel like that robs us of our humanity. So yeah, and I hope that I answer that very layered question.
Yeah, definitely. I mean, and you're right. We could be here for days talking about this shit, and I would happily do that, but we gotta get paid for it. But anyway, like that's such a like very important and nuanced take on the subject. Obviously, your experiences inform you of that, and I think what kind of like recalled like the concept of like tragedy porn, like that, privileged people and institutions use for disabled people and undocumented migrants and trans people and sex workers and all this stuff. So you really want like it's a way of stripping like humanity and agency away from vulnerable people who really deserve to have the space and the platform to tell their own stories and to say to people, no, you know what, shut the fuck up, you're going to listen to me and this is what I have to say. And I absolutely love that. I love that that about like your work and not just like in poetry, but your community work. I actually wanted to ask you on that note, I wanted to ask you a little bit about House of Alegría, because I know you're doing a lot of work with them and a lot of like work with queer undocumented migrants, like you said, but do you want to talk about it a bit?
Yeah, so my background is in undocumented organizing. So and I want to say 2007, 2008, right after graduating high school, I realized that I wanted to be in community and I wanted to do something about immigration policy. And I started organizing. This is at the peak, at the very beginning of many of us, this first wave of folks, of young people, young undocumented, specifically young undocumented queer, trans, non-binary folks, coming out undocumented and sharing it like publicly without shame, without like stigma, or like just like owning that truth, versus like the way during that time is like you have to be quiet about it, and for good reasons. There was mass deportations, many like um, anti-immigrant policies that were put in place that were targeting our communities. So there were good reasons. And also I feel that the larger migrant advocacy, it was like, we're going to advocate for you. Like migrant people don't have agency or voice. Like you wouldn't know what's best for you. And so we wanted to shift that dynamic, say, you know, our communities do have a voice, do have power. We have agency. We know what's good for us. We have solutions that can address some of the things that, you know, we are wanting. And so that was like my pivot of coming out undocumented during that time and organizing with other folks who were undocumented. And that built into a large movement, a national movement of undocumented young people just being like, fuck you, we're going to tell our stories, we're going to be in media, we're going to, you know, write it on our Tumblr, we're going to put it on Facebook, we're going to have coming out of the shadows events at different parks and cities, do civil disobedience actions, hunger strikes, and at the same time, you know, working to push policies, and at the same time also like creating like these like cultural pieces of like chapbooks, writing workshops, and just like telling our stories. And so that's my like my beginning of a background. I shifted over to doing cultural work because I wholeheartedly believe in the power of artists and cultural workers. We complement the policy work, we complement the organizing on the ground in ways that artists and culture workers are able to imagine and push the boundaries of what is possible for our communities. And I think that that was like a important critical work for the past decade. I took a break and shifted over to really looking at our ecosystem. Like now we're in a place in the United States, like social justice movement, where we recognize the importance of artists and cultural workers. However, at the same time, there's still a lack of investment and infrastructure to support our artists and cultural workers, specifically like Black, Indigenous, people of color, and specifically queer, trans, non-binary, undocumented, disabled artists. Like, and I think I wanted to address that gap. And so earlier this year, I launched House of Alegría, which is a multi-faceted project that, yeah, it's like myself, other, you know, queer trans folks as advisory board, just supporting and investing in our next wave of artists and cultural workers. And our first inaugural artist in residence is Alexa Vasquez, an incredible trans woman from Mexico. She's also featured in the anthology. We partner with Emerge NYC, which is a online, but also in person fellowship that supports emerging like artists in New York City. And because of the pandemic, they went virtual. So we were able to get Alexa to be part of it, full scholarship. Part of the House of Alegría is also making sure that we're not waiting for publishers to publish our work. Like that's giving them too much power. Like we can self-publish, and that's still a core of my work, owning my rights, owning the creative direction. And so we're working with Alexa to publish and her work, and she will have full control of her project. It's coming from my own money. Like we're, you know, it's part of a mutual aid framework too, that, you know, our ecosystems can be built within communities. We don't have to rely for funders, philanthropy to catch up to us to this like vision. We can do it, and we've always been doing it in community. So it's just a little bit more formalized under House of Alegría. And we also contract with other institutions who are interested in working with undocumented migrant artists. Oftentimes these institutions are so outdated or don't have the best working practices or procedures when working with undocumented folks. So like legit, there will be applications still asking for people's social security numbers, or triggering questions like, are you female or male? So I feel that this is us just like creating a space and just like decentering like all these institutional spaces that we as artists and cultural workers think that we have to go through, but we can make it within our own community and make it look like how we want it to look like, and invest among each other, and really uplift a mutual aid framework where we're interconnected and we can support each other, and that's how we've been surviving. Yeah.
On that note, I mean, it's so incredible the work that I'm saying that every time like I speak. It's just so incredible, but it's absolutely like commendable, all of the work that you've been doing, along with all the work that everyone else is doing as well. I want to like touch a little bit on that like mutual aid framework, because I mean, anybody who knows me knows that I'm a big proponent of mutual aid, and I hate hierarchies. And I really want to like talk about how does like mutual aid, and it sounds like House of Alegria, as well as many of your other projects, are like quite centered on um, deconstructing vertical hierarchies and organizing horizontally instead, which I absolutely love. I want to like ask you basically like, how do you think that informs the arts, and what role do you think that has to play within specifically decolonization of arts, of culture, of society in general? Um, and how do you think we can actually go forward with that? You know, what other aspects of decolonization do you think we should try and implement as artists or organizers or communities, etc.? Big question, but you know.
You know, we're keeping it light. No. I think these are important questions. Like how often do we get to have this conversation, and like virtually across like like rivers, oceans, like these are good questions. So I think for me is um, um, there's the recognizing that oftentimes arts and culture is looked upon as this like it's a cute thing, or it's like it's for the elite, or it's like it's a privileged thing, but it's not. Arts and culture lives in our community. It's in our language, it's in our food, it's in the way we dress, it's present in like memories, it's the music that we listen to, it's the places of worship that we go, it's our wellness, is our healing. And so shifting it to that direction, it also allows that it is oftentimes that our most impacted communities, our frontline communities, our communities of color, Black, Indigenous folks, like it's where like arts and culture is like it's taken away, or is like as the first place of attack, right? Like taking away the imagination, taking away the joy and the pleasure, taking away a space for like reflection, of care and creation. And so I think that centering like those tensions is important, as we're like imagining like what are the spaces that we're trying to push out, like how do we show up for community, because it shouldn't be like just a couple of individuals being able to have access to creating, imagining, living, enjoying life, laughing. It shouldn't, it should be masses, like it should be part of our daily life, be part of our routines, being able to see ourselves as creators, as having this like power to just like evoke better worlds. And so i think I'm trying to answer a part of your question of like the role of arts and culture, but also like what our movement spaces need, which is to reconcile that artists and culture workers were not just tools. Like arts and culture like is critical to our movement work, our ecological space, our the sustaining of our heart and our souls, as we're like trying to fight for liberation, but also like just live in the moment too. I I think as someone who's a formerly like organizer, community organizer, like on the ground, um, there's also this culture of burning out and being like this like martyr, giving yourself for the movement. But oftentimes like these quote unquote movement spaces are so like um, anti-trans, like very binary, very like toxic, racist, like, and there's also like these spaces of like like really like grounded community work, the may not be called movement work, but it's like community work where the mutual aid framework exists, where we are looking out for each other, where we're like intentionally saying like, have you eaten today? Like, did you have your meal? Have you had water? Do you want me to swing by and drop you off groceries? And we saw that during the pandemic, like even in our movement space and our hierarchies of like who's the leaders and who gets to speak on our issues, like let them be on TV screen, let them be on newspapers, let them be on all these different things. Um, some of the most real work that happened during the pandemic that we see it as like a micro of like this micro framework of like what exists in our communities is like this like very fluid, like showing up, interconnected way of caring for each other and allowing each other um, to check in, but also to provide for ways for them to feel good in the moment, to imagine, to create. Yeah, I also lost my train of thought, but I hope that it was going somewhere. Oh, and one last thing that I wanted to mention is that oftentimes we think of like caring for the arts and the culture. I've even in a lot of the arts and cultural spaces that I'm in, I'm always saying like, fuck the arts and culture. Like the first thing is like, how are the artists and the cultural workers? Like, how are they okay? Where there's a lot of emphasis on like their books or their visual piece that's going to be in the gallery, like, and taking care of that. And, you know, of course, like for archival reasons, yes, but like, how are we really like thinking about the artists and the cultural workers? Many of the artists and cultural workers and healers in our movement spaces in our communities often die without income, often houseless, have no food or access to healthcare. And so like, what are we really saying when a lot of the emphasis goes to arts and culture and not the artists, our cultural workers, our healers, our food makers, our gardeners, our folks who, you know, keep us alive.
That's so amazing. And again, it's, I guess, going back to that like question of agency and seeing people not as necessarily migrants or workers or this or that, but as people with whole ass personalities and dreams and like, well, you know what I mean. But anyway, that was really, really great. Thank you. I'm gonna like ask some different questions now because I want to talk a little bit about your work in particular, like your poetry, the writing that you do. And I want to ask like if Spanish and Quechua have any role to play in how you write, as well as how does like being Latina or the concept of Latinidad, how does it affect the way that you write as well?
Good questions. So the first question to like, how does like Spanish or Quechua show up like in my work? I think that my first language, I want to say that I was fluent in was Spanish. And once being put into schooling in the United States at the age of 5, that switched it over to being like predominantly English for many reasons of survival, of having to, you know, be forced, like assimilated, to be able to translate for my parents, to negotiate like bills and like cable stuff on behalf of my parents, and to also not be other in a particular way that can put me in danger. So this is like during like, I was gonna say like during like the height of like anti-immigrant policy, but I think we've like, that was not the height. We've seen many things have come up ever since then. But yeah, like I think that English was a language to help me navigate um, my life in the United States and help me survive and help me like move through. Spanish was like my home language. Like, you know, after class, you go home and you're speaking Spanish with your grandparents, and there's so much storytelling that happens in Spanish. Um, and I think that my work predominantly is like in English. It is, there are a couple of like wording, sentences, phrases that I've put, that I've inserted like Spanish wording in there, because that's how it has shown up for me in my conversations with my family. So if I'm like pulling in stories of my family or loved ones, or chosen family, like that's where I'm including Spanish. Quechua, oftentimes people ask me like, how come you're not fluent in Spanish, or how come you're not writing in Spanish? And I often wonder like, oh, how come people don't never ask me about Quechua? So that's my language, right? And for a very long time, I was like, felt very ashamed of like, that Quechua, that I'm not fluent in Quechua. It made me question my own like connections to my grandparents, indigeneity. Like, I was like, am I indigenous enough? Am I taking up space? And it wasn't until like I was with other Quechua folks, who were like, you're still Quechua even if you're not speaking Quechua. Like you're Quechua Cañari. Like it's in the memory, it's in your like in your lineage, it's in your love, it's the way you move through life. Like your whole existence is Quechua. Like you know, like it doesn't make you 1 ounce less if you're not speaking Quechua. Um and so I think that gave me permission to just like own that aspect of myself. And the United States does a great job at like drilling into you of like, um, robbing many like indigenous folks of their identity. So for a very long time, I was also ashamed that I was ashamed that, you know, that I wasn't claiming my indigenous self and like in a very heightened way. And it was also like I had to unlearn that no, like there's no shame of me even thinking that way. It was this country, this like colonialism that impacted the way that I see myself, that my communities see themselves. Um, and the layer to that is that, when you're undocumented, um, and and like in this like United States, like this like settled colonial framework of like, um, and you're also unable to go back to your home country. um, it's a difficult thing to like, which land are you from, like which land do you have permission from, which land is, you know, is yours to claim. I feel that in a lot of our immigrant rights movement, from folks who are not like indigenous, they're like, this is my country. I say, well, not really. Like you have to have like add another layer here too. Like you can't forget, our First Nation folks, you know, who's still fighting until this day for like sovereignty, for like for their for recognition. Many like layers here of conversations, and yeah. So I feel like Quechua plays itself into my work, when I'm like bringing in memories and also like the way that I'm moving in my queerness. And I took a Quechua course last summer, and it was like phenomenal to be in a space with other, um, folks who are like, in the diaspora, who are not in Ecuador, who are not um, in Cuenca or other places. They're like in Canada, or like myself, like they're like in New York, or like in LA, in Tongaland. And so like it was just an incredible space to be like, oh, we are Quechua, like, and even if we only know how to say Yupaichani, like we just thank you, like that's okay. Like there's no shame in what we're able to speak. Like again, it lives in our memory, it lives in our DNA, it lives in our like in our culture, it lives in our family, it lives amongst each other. And these are also folks who are, radical, who are queer, who are trans, who are non-binary, like taking this course. And I'm super grateful for Charlie Uruchima, who's been doing this, like sharing of Quechua and making room for us um, to to learn our language and also be compassionate to the fact that we may not know our language, and that's okay. Yeah, and we can take another break.